morning. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming along today. Today we are launching the second in the Building a New Scotland series of papers, refreshing the case for independence. Just to recap, in the months ahead we intend to cover currency, public finances and the economy, social security and pensions, defence and a range of other issues that are all intended to fully inform the choice on independence. Today's paper, though, focuses on democracy and democratic renewal. It exposes the significant and increasing democratic deficit that Scotland suffers as part of the Union. It shows that, far from being abstract, this deficit has real consequences for individuals, families and businesses, from the impact of austerity to the implications of a Brexit that Scotland did not vote for. And it argues that only independence can strengthen and embed democracy in Scotland and so provide a secure foundation from which to overcome challenges and fulfil our potential. Now, this discussion could not be more timely. The democratic deficit that Scotland faces is, of course, not a new or a recent phenomenon, but the evidence of it now is arguably starker than it has ever been. A Prime Minister with no democratic endorsement whatsoever from Scotland will be replaced by another Prime Minister that Scotland hasn't voted for, indeed wouldn't vote for, even if we were given the opportunity. And the change of Tory leader seems virtually certain to be accompanied by a shift even further to the right. And that means, of course, a shift even further away from the mainstream of Scottish opinion and values. A race to the bottom on tax, cuts to public services and support for families, more posturing over Brexit, hurting businesses and trade, abandonment of the fight against climate change, and a toxic, indeed wholly manufactured, culture war, putting equalities and human rights protections at risk. We may be just a few days into this Tory leadership contest, but it is already crystal clear that the issues Scotland is focused on, tackling child poverty, supporting NHS recovery, building a fairer economy and making a just transition to net zero, will be hindered, not helped, by whoever becomes Prime Minister in the weeks ahead. And added to all of that, the principle, which is long accepted until now, that the UK is a voluntary union of nations within which Scotland has the right to self-determination, is being torn to shreds. Indeed, all Scotland hears from UK politicians these days is democracy denial. They trade opinions on how many years it should be before Westminster might allow us to make a democratic choice about our own future. The fact that the Scottish people have repeatedly elected a majority in the Scottish Parliament committed to an independence referendum is treated as immaterial. You don't have to be a supporter of Scottish independence to know that that is not democracy. Now, that attitude is not surprising from Tories, and if it was just the Conservatives, it might matter less given the political death spiral they appear to be in. But these days, where the Tories go, Labour seems obliged to follow. So scared is Labour of Tory attacks from the right, and so obsessed with neutralising rather than standing up to these attacks, that they are becoming a pale imitation of the Tories rather than a real alternative. Now, that has implications for the direction of the UK as a whole and across the spectrum of social and economic policy. But here's what it means for Scotland. This is Labour's pitch to Scotland in a nutshell. To help Labour win in England, Scotland must suck up what we did not vote for: Brexit and all of its dire consequences must be accepted with no possible route back into the EU or even the single market. But what we did vote for, what we have repeatedly voted for, an independence referendum and the possibility of a better alternative, will be blocked by Labour in all circumstances and for all time. Just as in 2014, they are teaming up with the Tories to frustrate the will of the Scottish people. Earlier this week, we even had the grotesque spectacle of a Labour MP actually bragging about councillors in Edinburgh being suspended for refusing to back the Tories over the SNP. Labour's positions are nothing to do with the interests or the democratic wishes of Scotland. They are cynical political calculations based on, in my view, the deeply misguided belief that the way back to power is to adopt wholesale the policies of the Tory government they claim to oppose. For Scotland, this means, again, that our interests in democracy are to be sacrificed, sold out on the altar of winning Tory votes. It is perhaps history repeating itself. Margaret Thatcher, after she had left office, was reportedly once asked what she thought her greatest achievement was, and she replied, Tony Blair and New Labour. What she meant, obviously, was that she had forced Labour into adopting many of her policies in order to win power. Now, Boris Johnson's legacy will surely be defined by his manifest unfitness for office. But forcing Keir Starmer to make the journey from champion of Remain to arch Brexiteer may be seen in years to come as one of his only achievements. In short, what Scotland is hearing and seeing from Westminster parties encapsulates the democratic deficit that we face as part of the UK. Parties and policies that we reject forced upon us, but the democratic right to choose an alternative denied to us. And it underlines this point. Scotland really doesn't need, nor does it want, a pale imitation of or a temporary respite from Tory government. Scotland needs the real and the permanent alternative that only independence offers. Because stark though it is now, the democratic deficit isn't new. As today's paper sets out, it has existed over decades. Devolution has helped mitigate it, but it has not removed it. And that links, of course, back to the key theme of the first paper in this series. In that, we presented the extent to which, on a range of economic and social measures, neighbouring independent countries, similar in many ways to Scotland, are outperforming the UK. And we highlighted the fact that Scotland, as part of the UK, is effectively locked into that underperformance, despite all of the advantages we enjoy in human and natural resources. I firmly believe that it is only with the democratic powers to take the key decisions affecting our lives here that we can close that gap and reach our potential. And that, of course, is a key point. Independence is not separate from bread and butter issues. It is all about those issues. Independence is about building a stronger and fairer economy. It is about protecting the NHS and public services. It is about tackling the cost of living and ensuring that in this energy-rich country, the cost of heating our homes doesn't plunge people into dire poverty. It is about safeguarding the climate, human rights, and our place in the world. So in this paper, we set out where Scotland stands democratically and how that impacts on our economy and society. We show how out of sync Scotland's governance by Westminster is with our voting patterns and democratic choices, not just now, but over the long term. Not once in my entire lifetime have the Tories won a majority or even plurality of seats in Scotland. And yet for around 2/3 of my lifetime, Scotland has had to thole Tory Prime Ministers and policies. That is not democracy, nor is it abstract. Austerity, Brexit, anti-immigration measures, these are all policies we didn't vote for in Scotland, but which are damaging lives and living standards across our country. Finally and fundamentally, this paper makes the case that the democratic deficit cannot be fixed within a system founded on the principle of Westminster sovereignty. There is no constitutional reform in the UK that cannot be overturned or undermined on the whim of a Westminster majority. And we have seen that very clearly since the Brexit vote in 2016. Assertions of Westminster authority have become ever more pronounced, and the lack of institutional safeguards for devolution ever more obvious. Key Westminster decisions on Brexit, energy, social security, immigration, and much more besides are having profound and damaging effects on Scotland. There are no constitutional safeguards to properly protect the people of Scotland from these decisions. Even the Sewell Convention, which was of course designed to ensure that UK governments and Parliament did not legislate on devolved matters without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, has been completely and utterly trashed. Prior to Brexit, the exercise of Westminster sovereignty to frustrate Scottish Parliament decisions tended to be by financial means only. The refusal to transfer funds in relation to free personal care, for example, in the earlier days of the Scottish Parliament. But since 2016, Westminster has legislated against the express wishes of Holyrood, not once or even twice, but on no fewer than 7 occasions. And so it is in this light, I think, that pledges of more devolution or even a legal duty to cooperate as per the pathetically flimsy proposal put forward by Labour last week must be seen. Because even if the intention to deliver was in any way credible, it doesn't resolve the democratic deficit because ultimate power is retained by Westminster. And that really is the fundamental problem. No UK government of any party has ever shown the appetite for the fundamental UK-wide reform required to guarantee self-government for Scotland within the UK, because that would require Westminster to accept that it is not sovereign on all issues at all times, and I simply cannot see that ever happening. So in fact, independence is not just the best route to renewing and securing democracy in Scotland, to ensuring that we get governments we vote for, that our democratically elected Parliament cannot be overridden and undermined, and that we have a secure foundation on which to build the economic and social future that we want. Independence is not just the best route to all of that. Independence is the only credible route to that, which is why offering Scotland the choice of independence, particularly in the context we are in today, is essential. So I'll end by reiterating my commitment to do exactly that, and in so doing, to deliver on the mandate of the Scottish people. The Lord Advocate has now referred to the Supreme Court the question of whether Scottish Parliament legislation providing for an independence referendum without a Section 30 order relates to a reserved matter. This is intended to put the lawfulness of a referendum beyond doubt. It will also deny the Westminster establishment the ability to take refuge in endless arguments about process as a means of avoiding the substantive debate on independence. Now, I hope the court's decision will clear the path to a referendum on the 19th of October next year. That is what we are planning for. Of course, we cannot preclude the possibility that Westminster will succeed in blocking the route to a referendum, but that cannot, must not, and will not be allowed to mean that they succeed in blocking the right of the Scottish people to have our say on independence. So while we hope and plan for a referendum, this should also be clear. If a referendum is blocked by Westminster, we will put the choice to the people of Scotland in the general election. Either way, Scotland will have a choice. And not only will democracy then prevail, it will become the foundation stone on which we build a better nation. Thank you very much indeed for listening. I am now going to take questions from the media here. We've got a large number of attendees, so I'm going to try and get through as many of these questions as possible. I'll start with Glenn Campbell from the BBC.
Mr Minister, First Minister, is it fair for your opponents to question your commitment to democracy when you do not accept the outcome of the 2014 referendum or indeed the 2016 Brexit vote?
No, it's not fair, and neither of the things you've just put to me there are true. The outcome of the 2014 referendum was accepted. The evidence of that is Scotland is not independent. And the outcome of the Brexit vote in Scotland was that Scotland wanted to remain in the EU. That has not been honoured by UK parties and governments because Scotland is out of the EU. My stance has been that the outcome of that referendum should be honoured because Scotland should have remained within the European Union. But the more fundamental point, I guess, in relation to an independence referendum is that while the outcome of 2014 has been honoured and respected, people in a democracy have the right to change their minds, and to change their minds particularly when circumstances change. And it's actually the interplay between the 2014 referendum and the 2016 Brexit referendum that presents one of the biggest changes in circumstances. You know, you covered the independence referendum closely. You know that one of the key planks of the No campaign was EU membership. It was said in terms to people in Scotland that if we voted for independence, our membership of the European Union would be at risk. In fact, they went further and said we would lose membership of the European Union. That has happened because we are not independent. And the UK as it existed in 2014, a UK inside the European Union, is very different now because it is a UK outside of the European Union. There have been many other changes since 2014, which is getting close to a decade ago, not least the experience and the chaos of Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, a contest now to replace him as Prime Minister by somebody else Scotland will not have voted for, who's going to take the politics of the UK, I predict, even further to the right. So circumstances change and we live in a democracy. Democracy is not a moment of time, nor can it ever be the prisoner of any politician, whether that is me, Boris Johnson, whoever comes after him, Keir Starmer, or anyone else. Scotland has a right to self-determination and a right to choose its own future. Katie Hunter. Katie, sorry, hi.
Perhaps it's silly. Thank you. Perhaps it's silly of me to ask who you would like to be the next Prime Minister, the next Conservative Party leader, but from your point of view, who is the least worst option?
They all look pretty bad to me.
You must have ranked them.
I don't. It's not for me to rank them. You know, there's a basic democratic point here that is particularly acute perhaps for Scotland because, as I said earlier on, and, you know, I'm going to say this, I think without fear of contradiction or serious contradiction, Scotland wouldn't elect any of them as Prime Minister. And I think we can conclude that from Scotland's voting patterns over a very long period of time. But even across the UK, hardly anybody is getting to vote at all on who succeeds Boris Johnson. What's the UK membership of the Conservative Party? A couple of 100,000 or something. So, you know, this is a deeply undemocratic process to elect a Prime Minister in the circumstances that the UK is in just now. I think all of them will move the Tories to the right, and that is quite a big statement because the Tories are, certainly in terms of the Scottish mainstream, pretty right-wing already, and none of them seem to have anything to offer Scotland except democracy denial. So I don't see any of them offering anything positive for Scotland at all, and that's the problem. Scotland is facing yet another Prime Minister, the fourth in my time as First Minister, that we haven't voted for, would not vote for, and that will impose policies that we don't support. That is the argument, or one of the arguments, for independence in a nutshell. Ewan Petrie from SCV.
First Minister, I appreciate your preferred option is a referendum, but if it comes to a de facto referendum through a Westminster general election, how can you guarantee a 50% share of the vote in that would lead to independence? Well,
look, I'll set out, if we are in this scenario, because you're right, Ewan, it's not my preferred scenario. I don't think it should be anybody's preferred scenario. We have precedent in Scotland that the way to decide the question of independence and the way to decide significant constitutional issues is through a referendum. I think Whether you support or oppose independence, I think there should be an acceptance that that is the correct, appropriate, legitimate democratic route. That's the route I want us to take. But others are seeking to block that route. And if they succeed, I hope they don't, but if they succeed in blocking that route, then the choice for me is to just accept that Scotland has no right to self-determination and doesn't have a say, or to find another route through which the people of Scotland can express their views. And that will be a general election, because it is, in my view, unthinkable that we just don't get the opportunity to express our views. Now, if we are in that scenario post the judgment of the Supreme Court, and I'm not going to second guess that, these are matters now for the court to decide, I will set out in detail exactly what the proposition we're going to put to the Scottish people will be, and what we would intend to do with that should the Scottish people back us in that general election. And, you know, it comes down to this fundamental point here. I understand, sometimes I appreciate, I might get a bit exasperated at these questions, but fundamentally, what do I do if Westminster continues to refuse to accept democratic decisions of the Scottish people? There must come a point where I'm not the one expected to answer these questions. These are questions that have to be pinned on the politicians that are refusing to accept democracy. So your question now is effectively saying, even if more than 50% of the people of Scotland vote for the proposition of independence and Westminster refuses to accept it, what do I do? Well, I actually think if we end up in that position, that is really, really serious, because arguably we're in a position where we simply don't have democracy. So I will do everything I can to ensure that people get their say, that they get that say through a proper democratic constitutional process, and that what people in Scotland vote for is honoured. But others really have to answer some of these questions. Those who are denying democracy are the ones that have to answer the questions about the implications and the consequences of that denial of democracy. Louise Scott? Is Louise here? No. Kieran Jenkins from Channel 4.
Yes, Minister. Given your strong preference is to resolve this referendum issue with the UK government, and there is going to be a new Prime Minister, will you welcome the new Prime Minister with an open mind? And in particular, are you willing to compromise on your plans for a referendum?
I don't know what you mean about compromise, so that's a genuine question.
Is there room at all to compromise on the plans you've set out already? It's a new person you'll be dealing with.
So let me try and take that question I obviously take the question in good faith, but let me try to answer it and direct it to whoever. I don't know who's going to be the next Prime Minister, but direct it to them in good faith. And do that, I suppose, by going back in time. When we had the agreement in principle with David Cameron that we would have a Section 30 order to put beyond doubt the ability of the Scottish Parliament to legislate, we had a negotiation. And, you know, we didn't get everything we wanted out of that negotiation, nor did David Cameron's government. So I suppose, you know, I have been part of a process where compromise has actually been at its heart. So in principle, yes, in terms of the detail, I will be open to a negotiation. And in any negotiation, you have to be prepared to compromise. What I will not compromise on is the principle of people in Scotland getting the opportunity to cast their votes and make their views known on independence. So in answer to your question, to whoever the new Prime Minister is, as I said as recently as 2 weeks ago to Boris Johnson, I'm not going to, in the face of refusal of democracy by a UK government, to continue to beat my head off that wall. That's why I've set out a path that does not depend on that. But that's not me closing my mind to that path. It is still the best option to have two governments opposed on the substance coming together to agree the process. So if the new Prime Minister is open to that, I will be open to sitting down and in a spirit of compromise, seeking to come to an agreement. I notice in the media this morning comments of Rishi Sunak's from some time ago saying that Scotland should have the right to a referendum after Brexit. Well, it's after Brexit, so maybe if he is to hold to what he said before, there may be some room for discussions there if he emerges as the winner, which based on events over the past 24 hours, I don't think is in any way certain. So yes, I will be happy to sit down with the new Prime Minister if there is a willingness to do that. I'm not going to allow Scottish democracy to be the prisoner of a UK Prime Minister, and that is the point of principle. Alan Smith from Bauer.
Thank you, First Minister. You spoke at length about Labour's position on the Constitution, and we've heard Keir Starmer in recent months repeatedly rule out any potential deal or pact with the SNP at a future general election. I wondered if that's something that's ever been even discussed within the SNP about reaching a potential agreement with Labour at a future election.
No, and I'll come on to coalitions and the sort of SNP's ambitions, or perhaps lack of ambitions in terms of Westminster government. But on Labour's position, first of all, I mean, I understand Labour doesn't like the SNP. You know, that's democracy. But the fact of the matter is, whether Labour likes it or not, the SNP has won, overwhelmingly won, every election in Scotland in the past decade. So the SNP is Scotland's chosen government, Scotland's party of choice. So when you have Labour saying that they will never work with the SNP, or you know, the SNP is somehow beyond the pale, whether or not they want to acknowledge that, what they are doing is just disrespecting Scotland's democratic choices. They're effectively, in the pursuit of votes from the Tories in England, they're effectively given the proverbial, you know, 2 fingers to Scotland. Well, you know, that's Labour's choice, but they should not be surprised if the people of Scotland continue to take a really dim view of that. Labour's message to Scotland appears to be, we don't really care about you, you're just lobby fodder, and if you're not prepared to, you know, vote for us, your votes don't matter. Well, you know, I think Labour should understand by now that that is not a view that goes down particularly well in Scotland. So that's their choice, but they shouldn't be surprised if that kind of attitude keeps delivering them the kind of election results that they've seen in the past 15 years or so now. On the issue of coalitions, I mean, this really shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. The SNP's ambition is not to be in a Westminster government. It's not about Westminster coalitions. What I've said in the 3 general elections that I've now led the SNP in, I will say again today. While the SNP is in Westminster, we will always behave, operate and vote in a way that blocks the Tories out of office if we possibly can. We will always be part of, as progressive as we can find, an alliance against the Tories. So, you know, that is always going to be, certainly for as long as I'm leader, the stance of the SNP. But our objective is not to somehow be in a Westminster government. Our objective is to get out of Westminster and to offer Scotland a route out of the lack of democracy from Westminster governance and offer Scotland the choice of independence. So that's what we're focused on, and that is what everything I'm talking about today is very much about. We have next Jack Foster from Global.
Thank you, First Minister. Assuming that you manage to overcome the hurdles and you can hold a referendum next October on independence, and let's also assume that you were successful, what would there be to stop your opponents wanting to call another referendum, say a year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years after that, given that that precedent has been set by yourself, bearing in mind that the prospect of a Brexit referendum was known in 2014 and the prospect that that would be a UK-wide referendum in the event of a no vote was also known?
Well, firstly, the precedent hasn't been set in Scotland of having another referendum a year or a year and a half after the last one. I mean, we're now, 8 years after. Well, no, actually, in point of fact, that is not true. And you go back to the 2015 general election campaign and read what I said, you know, then. So circumstances have changed. Democracy is not a moment in time. But again, it's a bit like my answer to Kieran. I'm afraid if you want to, understandably, get answers to questions about what happens when Westminster politicians just refuse point blank to accept democracy in Scotland, then go and ask the Westminster politicians. I'm trying to pursue a democratic path to give people in Scotland the opportunity to choose their own future. And democracy is never just a moment in time. People in Scotland, if democracy and self-determination is to mean anything, must have that at all times. The second point I would make, though, is again, I suppose, challenging some of the premise of the question. You go back to, I saw on social media a few days ago, actually, a clip from a debate I did, I think, with Alistair Carmichael in the run-up to 2014, apart from sort of, you know, being appalled at sort of hairstyles and stuff back then, showing how long ago it is. You know, it was Alistair Carmichael in that clip who was, you know, saying that there wouldn't be any threat to the membership of the EU if Scotland voted no. That threat would come with yes. And I think he was making the point that, you know, David Cameron and the leader of his party and the leader of Labour were all against Brexit. So it wasn't the case that people voted in 2014 knowing that Brexit was going to happen. That actually is the polar opposite of what was put to the people of Scotland in that referendum. So look, circumstances change. I think people should have the right to change their minds when circumstances change. But the last point here is people can agree or disagree with me on the question of independence. And as we know, public opinion in Scotland is finely balanced on that question. What I believe, though, most people would agree with is that these are matters that can only be resolved democratically. I am seeking to find a democratic route to allow people in Scotland to choose their own future. And you're right, I've faced hurdles along the way because I'm up against politicians who are determined to frustrate a democratic process, that clearly don't feel confident about putting their arguments in a democratic process, so just want to block it. And that is not acceptable, and I'm not going to allow, if I can possibly avoid it, Scotland's choice to be frustrated in that way. I next have PA Hannah Carmichael.
Thank you, First Minister. Do you believe there should be a snap general election held to give the new Tory leader a mandate? And if so, how would that impact your intentions for it to become a de facto referendum?
Well, look, I believe in the circumstances that exist in the UK just now, you have a utter chaos at Westminster, a paralysis of government at a time when the need for active, decisive government couldn't be greater, you know, with the cost of living crisis, for example. So yes, I would relish and welcome a general election. If that happens, and I am not in control of that, I will set out exactly what the proposition from the SNP will be. You can absolutely take it as read. Independence will be front and centre of that. If you're asking my opinion on what will happen, I don't think there is going to be a snap general election. I assume whoever emerges from the Tory leadership contest is going to want some time to establish themselves, to try to recover some of the Conservative standing, if they can. And whether that will be possible is another question. So I don't think there is going to be a snap general election, but if there is, I will relish it. It will be the fourth general election I have fought in my less than 8 years as SNP leader, which in itself says something about the state of UK politics. And I'll set out at that point how the SNP will fight it and exactly the proposition we'll put forward. But at the moment, I'm going to continue to focus on the situation as it is and pursue the path that I have set out. Right, we are on now to print journalist Libby Brooks, The Guardian.
Thanks, First Minister. You've been talking about the right of people to change their mind, as particularly post-Brexit, but polling would certainly suggest there hasn't been a significant change of mind on the essential independence question, and we also know from polling that only a third of people are keen to have a referendum in the next year. And I just wonder what your message is to them about their democratic wishes.
Look, at polls, I'm not disputing the broad thrust of your question around polls there. I think opinion has changed since 2014. The vast majority, virtually all polls have shown a higher support for independence than was expressed on polling day in 2014. We've seen since I made the statement around the process in Parliament a couple of weeks ago, I think we saw a poll in the Sunday Times, if memory serves me correctly, after that, showing an increase in those people supporting the timescale I'd set out. We've seen polls before that showing that certainly support for a referendum within this term of Parliament is 50% or thereabouts. So polls, are not unimportant. I'm, a politician that regularly cites polls, so I'm not going to rubbish opinion polls that perhaps don't show what I want. But what I know from my experience in the run-up to 2014, it's that it's only really when you're in the debate for real around independence that people engage, properly in it and begin to absorb the information and make up their minds. That is the period we're going into now, I hope, in the run-up to a referendum in October next year, failing that, a general election. So, I look forward to getting really stuck in, as we are doing, to the substance of this debate, to putting forward, as we're doing today, and one theme, the positive case for independence, and also taking on some of the more challenging questions that people have about the process of independence, the transition to independence. That's the kind of substantive debate we should be having. We certainly intend to have it, and I would challenge anti-independence politicians to make their case on substance for why Scotland should remain within the current Westminster chaos. Paul Hutchin from The Record.
Thank you. Just to flip Jack Foster's question on its head, if there is a second referendum and the yes side lose it, can you give the Scottish people a categoric assurance that there will not be a third referendum?
Well, at risk of sort of generating, Paul, headlines that I think I managed the last time I sort of answered a question of this nature, that, headlines about my resignation, which I can tell you is not coming anytime soon. All I'd say is I suspect that wouldn't be a matter for me in the future. Look, democracy is never just a simple moment in time. I can't, even if I wanted to, I can't stand here and bind future incumbents of this office and people who will be in Bute House after me. These will be decisions that go in line with Scottish democracy. So I'll focus on the path that I have set out and seek to pursue that democratic route to independence. The final thing I would say is it is a question, obviously, based on a hypothetical. I believe very, very firmly, and I hope that this will be put to the test in October next year, but I believe very, very firmly that at the next time of asking, Scotland will vote yes for independence.
Do you believe that this referendum will settle the issue once and for all?
That is my intention, to settle it in favour of Scottish independence, yes. Andy Phillip from the Courier, PJ.
Hi. There's already a strong Conservative voters base in parts of Scotland, the Borders, Aberdeenshire, places like that, who presumably think that they already have a democratic say in electing the current UK government. And these people will still be around, there'll still be a fairly strong right-of-centre Conservative voters base in Scotland. I mean, what do you say to them, the people that you need to convince that they are suffering a democratic deficit right now?
Well, look, that's like me saying that in the days when the SNP, when I was first in politics, when the SNP only won, a very small number of seats in particular pockets of the country, that should somehow override the majority decisions across the country. Democracy and a parliamentary democracy, parties that win a majority of seats, parties that win a majority of seats win the election. That is I don't know what other kind of version of democracy we're meant to follow. But what I would say to people in any part of Scotland, and every part of Scotland matters, and everybody in every part of Scotland matters. But independence is about ensuring that we get the governments we vote for, that the party or parties that win elections govern us, not the opposite of that. And if the Conservatives in an independent Scotland can put forward a proposition that persuades people to vote for it and deliver a parliamentary majority, then the Conservatives will be in government. If Labour manages that, Labour will be in government. If my party manages it, we'll be in government. That is the whole democratic case for independence, that we get the governments we vote for, rather than now, where we have and have had, as I said earlier on, for the vast bulk of my lifetime, we've had prime ministers that Scotland have rejected. That's not democracy. So it's about having a normal, vibrant democracy in Scotland that delivers the outcomes that people choose. Abby Garton-Crosby from the National.
Thanks, First Minister. I just wanted to ask, we had a little bit of drama at the beginning of PMQs yesterday where two Alba MPs were escorted out. So, you know, you talked about compromise from the Tories, but don't know who the next leader is going to be. If there is no compromise, will it get to a point where you tell your SNP MPs to boycott Westminster and ask them to leave? And I was going to ask as well, do you know when the next paper is going to be coming?
No, I don't support a boycott. While Scotland is part of the UK, it is really important that we have MPs standing up for Scotland's interests in the best way and to the best extent possible. Now, Westminster and the asymmetrical nature of Westminster and the democratic deficit means that it's really hard to have Scotland's interests properly represented at Westminster. But people have elected SNP MPs while we're part of the UK to do a job, and I think it's important that our MPs do that, and they do that, and they do that well. The next paper will be, I don't have the date for it yet, it will be later in the summer, probably roundabout, given the summer holiday period and other things like the Edinburgh Festival kicking in, probably around the time that Parliament is going back after the summer. But there is no firm date for it yet. Alistair Grant from the Scotsman.
Hi, First Minister. Thanks very much. The court papers show the Lord Advocate was clear that she didn't have the necessary degree of confidence to sign off on the Indy Ref 2 legislation. If the Supreme Court throws out the current case on the basis that it's premature, as the UK government wants, would you consider introducing it through a backbench MSP, just so it doesn't need Lord Advocate sign-off, just to ensure that the kind of legal issue is at least settled? And can I also just double-check, just on Kieran's question earlier, is a date for a referendum next year up for negotiation with the next Prime Minister?
Look, I've set out the path I want to take. That is a path I am going to pursue. So I'm not going to start to speculate on the views of a Prime Minister I don't even know the identity of yet. That's the path I have set out. If somebody wants to come to me and say, look, we'll have a Section 30 order and here's the negotiation we want to have, of course I will listen to that, but I've set out the path. On the first part of your question, well, firstly, I'm not going to, because I don't have the ability to speak for the Lord Advocate, and you also know the constraints that are on me in terms of talking about legal advice. But I do think, just in point of fact, there perhaps has been a bit of a mischaracterisation of some of what was in the referral that was published. In point of fact, I made a positive decision not to introduce a bill at this stage, instead to ask the Lord Advocate to refer the matter to the Supreme Court. So what that means is the pre-legislative processes that you would go through to introduce a bill were not triggered, let alone concluded. So I think it's important just to be clear on that point. And the reason for making that decision is that this is a contested and genuinely unresolved area of law. So nobody can have confidence that it is either within or out with the powers of the Scottish Parliament. That's what we are asking the court to determine. And had we introduced a bill, just hypothetically, all of those people, political opponents who are, seeking to shout about the supposed views of the Lord Advocate wouldn't have accepted the lawfulness based on that pre-legislative certification process. They would have continued to cast doubt on the lawfulness, and it would have gone to court eventually. It may have taken a long, winded route through the court, starting in the court session and going all the way to the Supreme Court. So this, in my view, is the better route, because more quickly it gives us the legal certainty that I think everybody, including Parliament, when it comes to legislate, has a right to have. And it does that in a way that means politicians no longer need to argue about legality and process, because the highest court in the land is literally being asked to determine that question. So politicians can and should get on with the task of debating the substance. That's what we are going to do. And I think every day and week that passes, with the absence of any positive case for the union, will speak louder and louder to the Scottish people about what that means. Right, who is next? Lucanio from the Financial Times.
Good
afternoon, First Minister. I was actually going to ask more or less the same question, based on what the UK government said this week about you asking a hypothetical question to the Supreme Court, and whether then, if they agreed, you would go ahead with the legislation, or whether then that would mean the process basically waits until 2024.
I'm not going to get into that because I think it's for the court to determine these matters now. I don't think it's a hypothetical question. There is a bill that we are wanting to introduce. So it's a very real question, and also the power that the Lord Advocate is exercising is a very express one under the Scotland Act. So it's not like, if we go back to the case, the so-called Keating's case, where a member of the public asked a genuinely hypothetical question of the court. It's a different set of circumstances. But these are matters that are not for me to determine. They are matters to be argued before and ultimately decided by the Supreme Court. And I think I'm going to, I know I'm going to respect the right of the court to do that. David Ball from the Herald.
Thank you, First Minister. Following on from Alistair's question about the Supreme Court, do you see any merit in the fact that the UK government is arguing that the court action should happen at the end of the parliamentary process? Obviously, your bill could get amended. It could look very different. So do you see any merit in that argument that maybe the court action will still inevitably happen at the end of the process?
No, I mean, presumably you've looked at the draft bill. We passed, you might have concluded that we have been planning our route through this for some time. So we passed the framework bill for referendums, 2020 or before that, actually, I can't remember, but well before the last Scottish election. So all of the detail about the conduct of referendums is already on the statute book. This is a very short bill, and in terms of the substance of it, there's not that much scope for substantive amendment. So I don't think that is a particularly valid argument, but it's not for me to decide that. That is for the court, the Supreme Court to decide, and I'm not going to stray further into that. The only thing I would say, coming back to the political sphere, I suppose, is, we know that the UK government and unionist parties are running scared of the substantive debate on independence. All I'd say is, looking at the initial response to the Supreme Court action, it looks as if they're running scared of even making a substantive argument on the process. So, I think all of that speaks volumes. But on these issues, it's now for the court to decide, and they will do that in the way that they consider appropriate, and I will respect the outcome of the court, whatever it is. Kieran Andrews from Times.
Thanks, First Minister. You have used Brexit as a central plank in this argument in the paper today. There's a section on EU membership. I just wondered how long you think an independent Scotland will take to get into the EU or the EU single market, and how long it will be that an independent Scotland will be out of the UK single market and not in the EU single market.
Well, we will set out, so I'm not attempting not to answer your questions here today. We will set out a paper in full, one of the series of papers on process of regaining EU membership, which will also cover transitionary arrangements, both the transition period from a vote for independence to Scotland becoming independent and the process. So we will set all of that out, and these are issues that we are continuing to develop and work on at the moment. What I would say at this stage is there will be a process for Scotland to go through to be back in the EU. That is absolutely the case. As others have said from the European side, there is nothing to say that would necessarily be a very lengthy process, because Scotland has been in the European Union and complies with the acquis, and of course we are seeking to keep pace with European legislation on, for example, environmental protections right now. But there will be a process, and we will respect that process, which is why we will set that out in detail. But I think the more fundamental point is, whatever the detail of that is in terms of the progress of Scotland back into the EU, independence is actually the only way now of getting back into the EU and the single market, and having the ability to trade in that single market that is 8 times the size of the UK, while also protecting our trade across the UK. And of course, one of the other papers we will set out will be around trade and border issues that arise from Brexit. So in all of this debate, I don't want to escape or elide any of these issues. Some of these issues have genuinely complex questions attached to them. That is why this process we are going through is so important, because when Scotland does come to vote on this, it is important that that vote is informed and that people take a rounded view of the challenges of independence, but also, as I would argue, the opportunities which vastly outweigh those challenges. Right, sorry, I'm losing track here. Chris Green from the Eye.
Thanks very much, First Minister. Just to go back to Abby's question on the Alba protest yesterday, do you think that helped or hindered the independence cause? And if an SNP MP were to do similar, would you support them?
I didn't pay that much attention to it, so I'm not going to focus on that. Your protest always has a place. SNP MPs, I mean, Ian Blackford was ejected from the House of Commons not that long ago. I can understand, I've never been a member of the House of Commons, as you know, but I can understand for Scottish MPs how deeply frustrating that environment must be. But I'm focused on not protest here, I'm focused on giving Scotland a path to choosing independence. And I think that is much, much more important. I'm the First Minister, I'm not, my job is not to indulge in gesture politics. My job is to find ways forward on this and on other issues, and that's what I'll focus on doing. Simon Johnson from The Telegraph.
Thank you, First Minister. Just going back to Alice's question, I mean, it did say in the referral that the Lord Advocate does not have the necessary degree of confidence that a referendum bill would be within Holyrood's powers. So how is it possible that you could be confident that you could introduce such a bill, given that was the assessment in the referral? And secondly, if I can just ask about something else briefly, you said in March that you'd be willing to take in a Ukrainian refugee into your home if needed. Well, we saw the super sponsor scheme suspended earlier this week because of a shortage of accommodation. And I just wondered if you'd be now taking that step. Thank you.
On the first question, I was simply, which I know will be always important to the Daily Telegraph, I was simply stating a fact. I'm not speaking for the Lord Advocate, nor am I trying to sort of negate anything that is in the referral. I'm simply stating, in fact, because I think some of the reporting was that I had been blocked from introducing a bill. We didn't go through the pre-introduction processes. I took a decision not to go down that path, but to go down the path of asking the Lord Advocate. So that's just a statement. In fact, well, I don't speak for the Lord Advocate, neither do you, and therefore I think it's probably important that I just... I'm not entirely sure why you don't understand this. There is a set out process for the pre-introduction period of a bill. We haven't gone through that. That is just a simple statement of fact. It's obvious why now, isn't it? Well, but the other point, well, no, it's not. I've set out why, because I think this is a better route. But the other point is, and perhaps people just need to move their arguments on with kind of reality now. This idea, the question that you've put to me is based on, certainly when it comes from opposition politicians, this notion that I'm somehow trying to avoid legal reality. I have literally asked the Lord Advocate to get a determination on the law from the highest court in the land. So I'm not trying to escape whatever turns out to be legal reality here. I'm actually trying, for the benefit of all of Scotland, to get clarity on that. So I think some of these arguments are perhaps a little bit dated, given the developments we've seen in the past couple of weeks. On your second question, look, I've always said and say again, if that is an appropriate thing to do, I will always play my part. I think I've also said, I'm not sure that living with the First Minister for somebody seeking refuge, given the scrutiny and the publicity around that, would be something people would want to do. But that is something that I will continue to consider on an ongoing basis. My job as First Minister, though, is to make sure that we are not just giving refuge to one person from Ukraine, but that we're able to give refuge to thousands of people from Ukraine. Regrettably, we've paused the scheme, hopefully temporarily, in order to ensure that those already here and those who have visas and have the right to come here are supported into permanent accommodation, not just temporary accommodation. But that actually has come from the fact that there are 7,000 Ukrainians, around about 7,000 already in Scotland. That is more than double the 3,000 that we initially indicated we thought we would be able to support. And of all of the visas granted in the UK, and not all of these have arrived yet, of course, but of all of the visas, you know, Scotland with 8% of the UK population, 20% of all visas are for people who want to come to Scotland. So Scotland is more than playing our part within the UK, and I think it's really important that we continue to do so. But that means ensuring that we support people from temporary accommodation into permanent accommodation. The pause will allow us to do that, and then hopefully in months to come give refuge to even more people. Rachel Watson from The Sun.
Thank you, First Minister. You've criticised the Conservatives for concentrating on internal battles while there's a cost of living crisis impacting families across the UK at the moment. But is that not a bit hypocritical when you're here talking about independence, how you're going to get a referendum and have your government working on these documents? And also, you've turned a lot of your political attack lines on Labour today and in recent days. Are you concerned about a Labour government and what that could mean for your independence push?
No, I'm not particularly concerned about Labour. I'm just trying to sort of make sure my views are known across the range. But I think it's, well, people in Scotland will make their views known on Labour, and Labour seems intent on pursuing a position in relation to Scotland that has relegated it to, you know, third place in Scottish politics. It's entirely up to Labour if they want to continue repeating the mistakes of the past. You know, be my guest, but I don't think it is going to go down well in Scotland. And on the first part of your question, no, I don't accept that. You know, some internal Tory leadership contest that has arisen out of utter chaos and is paralysing the UK government and the UK at a time of such need across the country is a world away from having a democratic debate about how Scotland equips itself with the resources, the powers and the levers to better address challenges like the cost of living. Independence is not abstract. Independence is about how we build a good economy. It's about how we protect public services. It's about how we ensure our place in the world and trade across the single market. So it is about how we stop a situation or move on from a situation where Scottish governments so often are trying to address these issues with one hand tied behind our back at best, and equip the Scottish Parliament with the powers we need to properly address all of these issues. Michael Blackley. Michael here. Sorry.
Thank you. If I could just return to the issue of the Supreme Court. You're making clear today that you need the legal clarity from the Supreme Court before introducing and progressing independence referendum legislation. So what does happen, just to be clear, if the Supreme Court agrees with the UK government that it would be premature to make a ruling at this stage? Will you really progress that legislation without that legal clarity from the Supreme Court?
Well, firstly, I'm not just making that clear today. I made that clear 2 weeks ago. I'm sorry if it's taken a little bit of time for the Daily Mail to catch up with it, but there we have it. And look, I'm going to let the court decide these issues now. I'm the one who is not just seeking a democratic path forward for Scotland, but a democratic path that is undeniably and indisputably lawful. And therefore, I'm going to let the court decide, and I will respond to, you know, whatever the outcomes of that are at appropriate moments. But I think having asked the Lord Advocate to ask the highest court in the land for a determination, it's important and appropriate to allow the Supreme Court to do its work. Right, I think that now concludes questions, in which case can I thank you all very much for your attendance.